Stay with me for a moment, because what's unfolding right now isn't just another headline, another trade dispute, or another round of diplomatic posturing that will be forgotten in a week. This is one of those quiet inflection points that only becomes obvious in hindsight, the kind historians circle decades later and say, that's where the rules started to break. When Donald Trump crossed this particular economic line, it wasn't the noise of the announcement that mattered. It was the reaction, the sudden pauses, the recalculations, the fact that leaders who rarely agree on anything all responded with the same unspoken question. If this rule no longer holds, what else no longer does? For most people, global economics feels abstract, like something that exists on spreadsheets, central bank statements, or late-night financial news shows. But underneath all of that complexity sits a surprisingly simple foundation: predictability. For decades, the global system has operated on a shared assumption that certain economic principles are not weapons. They are guardrails. They're the reason countries trade instead of threaten, negotiate instead of coerce, and compete within boundaries instead of tearing the whole structure apart. The rule Trump broke wasn't written into law, but it was understood everywhere. You do not deliberately weaponize interdependence with your closest partners unless you are prepared for the system itself to change. That's why the reaction wasn't immediate outrage. It was something far more telling. Silence, followed by cautious statements, followed by quiet emergency meetings that never made the headlines. European officials didn't rush to microphones. Asian finance ministries didn't issue fiery condemnations. Instead, they started running scenarios. What if this isn't a bluff? What if this is the new operating logic? What if the world's largest economy has decided that stability is optional? For decades, the United States has benefited from a unique position. It wasn't just powerful, it was predictable. Allies trusted that while American politics might swing, the underlying economic rules would hold. Markets trusted that supply chains wouldn't be casually detonated for leverage. Governments trusted that trade agreements were foundations, not bargaining chips to be smashed publicly. That trust is why the dollar sits where it does, why U.S. Treasuries function as they do, and why American economic decisions ripple outward with such force. Trump didn't just challenge another country. He challenged the assumption that America still sees itself as the system's anchor. What made this moment especially destabilizing wasn't the action itself. Tariffs have existed before. Trade disputes aren't new. Even aggressive negotiations aren't unprecedented. What shocked observers was the framing. This wasn't presented as a temporary measure or a reluctant response. It was framed as a declaration of independence from interdependence itself. A statement that the United States no longer needs to consider how deeply embedded it is within the very system it dominates. To economists and policymakers watching closely, that framing set off alarms far louder than any specific percentage point or policy detail. World leaders understand something most voters never need to think about. Economic systems don't fail loudly at first. They fail quietly, through adjustments, hedges, and slow withdrawals of trust. The moment a rule like this is broken, rational actors don't panic. They adapt. They start asking how exposed they are, where they're vulnerable, and how quickly they can reduce reliance on a system that now feels unstable. That process doesn't show up in headlines the next day, but it reshapes trade flows, investment decisions, and alliances over years. Behind closed doors, the conversations were blunt. European leaders questioned whether long-term trade assumptions with the United States still made sense. Asian economies quietly revisited their exposure to American policy swings. Energy-importing nations began reassessing supply diversification, not because of immediate shortages, but because the political risk premium had suddenly changed. When the rules are stable, efficiency wins. When the rules are volatile, resilience becomes everything. This is where the contrast becomes critical. Trump's supporters often interpret these moves as strength, as proof that America is finally throwing its weight around instead of playing by what they see as unfair rules. But from the outside, the move reads very differently. It looks less like dominance and more like unpredictability. And unpredictability is not strength in a system built on trust. It's a liability. The most powerful players don't need to constantly remind others of their power. The system already does that for them. What makes this moment so consequential is that there is no clean reversal. Even if the policy itself is softened, delayed, or quietly adjusted, the signal has already been sent. The idea that economic interdependence is conditional, revocable, and subject to personal political calculus has entered the global bloodstream. Leaders who once assumed continuity now assume contingency. They may still work with the United States, but they will no longer design their futures around it in the same way. This is why reactions around the world have been measured but serious. No one wants to escalate unnecessarily. No one wants to trigger panic. But everyone understands that a line has been crossed, and lines like this don't uncross cleanly. The world is now operating under a new assumption, that long-standing economic norms are negotiable, even disposable, depending on who is in power and what leverage they want to apply. And once that assumption takes hold, everything downstream changes. Investment timelines shorten, redundancies increase, trust thins, the system becomes less efficient, more fragmented, and more brittle. These are not abstract concerns. They translate into higher costs, slower growth, and a world where cooperation is replaced by hedging and suspicion. This is the real story behind the reactions you're seeing. Not outrage, not applause, but recalibration. The recognition that a rule which once held the system together has been treated as optional. And when the largest player signals that rules are flexible, everyone else starts preparing for a world where stability is no longer guaranteed. They also understand something else that rarely gets said out loud. Economic power is most effective when it doesn't have to announce itself. For decades, the United States shaped global outcomes, not by forcing compliance, but by setting conditions others chose to operate within. Trade rules, financial norms, reserve currency dynamics, and supply chain architectures all tilted in America's favor because participating in that system was still better than opting out. That balance only works when participants believe the system itself is durable. The moment durability comes into question, the incentives change, and those changes compound quietly. What Trump disrupted wasn't just a policy framework, but a shared mental model. World leaders operate on expectations formed over generations. They assume certain behaviors are off limits because violating them produces more long-term damage than short-term gain. One of those assumptions was that deeply integrated economic relationships, especially with allies, were not to be treated as leverage points in public power plays. Breaking that assumption doesn't just affect the immediate target. It forces every connected actor to rethink their own exposure. That's why the most consequential reactions didn't come in speeches, but in spreadsheets. Ministries of finance began stress testing scenarios that had previously been considered too extreme to prioritize. What happens if access becomes conditional? What if tariffs escalate unpredictably? What if agreements once treated as stable are suddenly bargaining chips? These aren't academic exercises. They determine where factories are built, which ports are expanded, which currencies are held, and which partners are trusted with long-term commitments. The irony is that the very interdependence Trump dismisses as weakness is what gave the United States its unparalleled leverage in the first place. When others structure their economies around access to your market, your currency, and your infrastructure, you don't need to threaten them. Influence is automatic. But when you explicitly frame that access as something that can be revoked arbitrarily, rational actors begin designing around you. They may not leave immediately, but they stop building deeper ties. You can already see the early stages of this shift. Trade diversification strategies that once moved at a glacial pace are accelerating. Not because alternatives are cheaper or better, but because they're safer. Governments are willing to accept inefficiency as insurance against political volatility. That trade-off would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Today, it's becoming standard risk management. Another layer of concern comes from how this move reframes precedent. If economic interdependence can be weaponized openly, then no relationship is truly exempt. Allies start asking themselves uncomfortable questions. If this can happen to one partner, why not another? If economic pressure is now a first resort rather than a last, what guarantees remain? These questions don't require hostile intent to be damaging. The mere possibility alters behavior. This is where contrast framing becomes essential. Domestically, the move is often sold as reclaiming sovereignty, restoring leverage, or correcting imbalances. Internationally, it's interpreted as a sign that the rules-based order is becoming transactional. The difference between those interpretations matters. One frames the action as corrective, the other frames it as corrosive. And once enough actors adopt the latter view, the system itself begins to fragment. It's also worth noting that this rule wasn't maintained out of altruism. It existed because it worked. Economic stability produced growth. Predictability attracted capital, and trust reduced friction. Breaking the rule doesn't just impose costs on others. It introduces inefficiencies into the very system that generated American prosperity. That's why even leaders sympathetic to Trump's domestic messaging reacted cautiously. They understand that short-term leverage often carries long-term costs that don't show up on political timelines. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it encourages symmetry. If one major player treats economic ties as weapons, others will eventually do the same. Once that behavior normalizes, the system becomes more adversarial by default. Instead of cooperation being the baseline and coercion the exception, the roles reverse. This doesn't lead to collapse overnight. It leads to stagnation, fragmentation, and constant low-grade instability. There's also a psychological component that rarely gets discussed. Trust, once damaged, doesn't require constant reinforcement to erode further. It decays on its own. Each new decision is filtered through suspicion. Each negotiation takes longer. Each agreement requires more safeguards. Over time, the cumulative drag becomes significant. Growth slows not because of a single policy, but because the environment itself becomes heavier, more cautious, more defensive. World leaders are acutely aware of this dynamic, which is why their reactions have been so carefully calibrated. They are trying to signal concern without provoking escalation, adaptation without abandonment. But make no mistake, adaptation is happening. Supply chains are being reimagined. Investment flows are being rerouted. Strategic autonomy, once a fringe concept, is becoming mainstream policy. Trump's move didn't force these changes directly. It legitimized the logic behind them. It told the world that assumptions once considered safe could be overturned without warning. In doing so, it made hedging rational rather than paranoid. And when hedging becomes rational, systems built on trust inevitably lose coherence. This is the deeper consequence most commentary misses. The issue isn't whether this specific policy succeeds or fails on its own terms. It's whether the underlying rule can be restored. Because rules like this don't function through enforcement. They function through shared belief. Once belief is fractured, repairing it takes far longer than breaking it. And that's why reactions around the world have been subdued but serious. Leaders aren't reacting to a tariff, they're reacting to a signal that the economic order they've planned around may be entering a more volatile phase, one where power is asserted more openly and stability is treated as optional. Preparing for that world doesn't require public confrontation. It requires quiet, deliberate change. What ultimately unsettles policymakers is not just the immediate disruption, but the long shadow it casts over future decision-making. Economic systems are forward-looking by design. Contracts, investments, and alliances are built on expectations about what tomorrow will look like, not just today. When a long-standing rule is broken, it injects uncertainty into every future calculation. Even if nothing else changes, the knowledge that it could is enough to alter behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Consider how trust functions at this level. It isn't emotional or sentimental, it's operational. Trust means fewer safeguards, fewer contingencies, fewer costs built into every transaction. When trust erodes, the opposite happens. Redundancy becomes necessary. Parallel systems are built. Alternatives are funded even if they're less efficient. These choices make sense individually, but collectively they slow the entire system down. What once flowed smoothly now moves with friction. This is why the reactions from world leaders have emphasized long-term implications rather than immediate retaliation. They know that escalation would only accelerate fragmentation. Instead, they are signaling a shift in posture, a move from assumption to verification, from reliance to optionality, from integration to resilience. None of these shifts are dramatic on their own, but together they mark a profound change in how the global economy is organized. There's also an internal contradiction at the heart of Trump's approach that foreign observers notice immediately. Power derived from interdependence depends on others choosing to stay connected. Power derived from coercion encourages others to leave. You can extract concessions in the short term, but you weaken your position over time. The very act of demonstrating that you can break the rules makes others question whether they should continue playing by them. This doesn't mean the United States suddenly loses influence. Far from it. But influence begins to look different. Instead of being the default center around which systems are built, it becomes one powerful option among several. That distinction matters enormously. When you are the default, others adapt to you. When you are an option, you have to compete. Another overlooked consequence is how this shift reframes domestic debates elsewhere. Leaders who once struggled to justify diversification away from American markets now have a clear argument. They can point to volatility and say this isn't ideology, it's prudence. Policies that once seemed expensive or unnecessary suddenly appear responsible. Political resistance softens. Structural change becomes possible. The most revealing aspect of this moment is that it didn't require a crisis to trigger these reactions. There was no war, no financial collapse, no natural disaster, just a decision framed as breaking with convention. That alone was enough to force a reassessment. It shows how much of the global order rests not on enforcement, but on expectation. When expectations shift, reality follows. Some will argue that this is overblown, that systems are resilient and will adapt without lasting damage. There is truth in that. The global economy won't unravel overnight. Trade will continue. Markets will function. But resilience shouldn't be confused with immunity. Systems can absorb shocks while still being permanently altered by them. The path forward may still exist, but it may look very different from the one that was assumed before. In private, many leaders are asking whether this moment represents a temporary deviation or a structural change. That question matters more than any single policy outcome. If it's temporary, adjustments can be limited. If it's structural, then the entire framework needs to be reconsidered. Planning for that second possibility is already underway, quietly and methodically. This is where the contrast between rhetoric and reality becomes stark. Domestically, breaking a rule can be framed as boldness. Internationally, it's read as risk. Both interpretations can coexist, but only one shapes long-term behavior, and it's the international interpretation that determines how capital flows, where factories are built, and which alliances deepen or decay. The real danger isn't that others respond aggressively, it's that they respond rationally. Rational responses don't make headlines. They don't provoke dramatic confrontations. They simply redirect momentum. Over time, that redirection compounds. Influence dissipates not through conflict, but through irrelevance. This is why so many reactions have emphasized concern for norms rather than specific outcomes. Norms are the invisible infrastructure of the global system. You only notice them when they're damaged. Once damaged, rebuilding them requires more than policy reversals. It requires sustained consistency across administrations, across crises, across years. Trump's move has forced the world to consider a future where such consistency can no longer be assumed. That doesn't mean cooperation ends. It means it becomes conditional, cautious, and more transactional. The irony is that this is precisely the environment in which large, complex economies perform worst. As this story continues to unfold, the most important developments won't be the loudest ones. They'll be the quiet adjustments, the subtle shifts in alignment, the incremental rebalancing of dependence. Those changes are already in motion. They don't depend on further escalation. They depend on the recognition that a long-standing economic rule was treated as optional, and that once that happens, no rule ever feels entirely safe again.